The high-level dialogues were always about more than economics. In the Bush administration, a number of foreign policy issues were addressed in what we call the senior dialogue, which was led by a Deputy Secretary of State. What has happened now is that the level for the strategic side of the dialogue has been raised to the secretary level, and they have been combined in one umbrella structure. But once the meeting is convened, then the two break up into an economic dialogue and a strategic dialogue. So not so much has changed. What's important is that we are talking at a high level with a variety of Chinese institutional interlocutors. First of all, the path to growth that China has taken, one that depends on rapid expansion of exports, does create a macro imbalance with the rest of the world, and particularly with the United States, because we got into the habit of consuming those goods. If we do not rectify that imbalance, that will become almost a security problem for the United States. With respect to China's military development, which is occurring at a steady and systematic pace, that does not challenge U.S. security per se. It does challenge, or may be seen to challenge, the security of our allies, Japan and South Korea, and our quasi-ally Taiwan. It also involves Chinese military units, particularly air and naval, operating in areas that the U.S. Navy used to see as its monopoly. And it was the forward extension of our forces that gave us a greater sense of security. Now China wants to push out into the same area to improve its security. And we saw symptoms of this contest in early 2009 when vessels associated with the Chinese Navy harassed U.S. reconnaissance ships. I don't think there's a risk of deliberate conflict. The problem comes with situations or episodes that can occur through accident or miscalculation, where the Chinese naval vessels that are seeking to extend China's security perimeter in the maritime area challenge us in a way that we feel we have to respond. Another possibility that's existed in the past has been that the United States and China might come into conflict because of a prior contest between China and Taiwan that occurred through accident or miscalculation. Finally, the United States is not the only actor in the East China Sea. Japan has a fairly substantial navy, fairly significant air force, and it also has interests in preserving its security in that area. Chinese views of the United States are mixed. On the one hand, we're respected for our values, particularly when we adhere to them. Second, we are a source of high technology, capital, good education. All of that has spurred China's economic growth over the last 3 decades. On the other hand, there is also a perception, which the communist government has not seen fit to negate, that the United States is somehow blocking China's return to great power status. I think that's an incorrect perception, but it does feed what China does. The communist government sees this as a two-sided problem. On the one hand, nationalism improves their legitimacy. They're proud of what their country has been able to do. On the other hand, there's always the concern that this nationalistic feeling could be turned against the regime itself because people think that the government is being too soft in its dealings with the United States or Japan or Taiwan. It depends. I think the next 2 or 3 decades will determine what kind of great power China is going to become. And the key to this is how we interact and shape China's future trajectory. I think on a variety of issues, Taiwan, North Korea, Iran, the global economy, climate change, we will interact with China for good or ill. Each of us will learn lessons from that interaction about the broader intentions of the other. An optimist would hope that we manage these issues in a way that both of us have less reason to fear each other. A pessimist would say that negative conclusions and suspicion are inevitable. Well, it's understandable that China would want to secure its supply of natural resources from Africa and other places for that matter. It has become a leading manufacturing center in the world, and natural resources are what drive that. China, in effect, is replacing us as the key manufacturing center. I suppose the main implication is, and what matters most for the United States, is how China's quest for resources affects governance in Africa and affects environmental protection. Because, at least at the outset, China is pursuing this in a way that promote corruption, promote environmental damage. It may be that China will come around and move in a direction that other countries have done in dealing with Africa. Also, it's worth noting that China is not a monolith in this regard. In a number of cases, the government is following Chinese national companies, and they are the ones that are cutting the deals and then depending on government support. I think in 2010 the key issue is going to be North Korea. We would all hope that North Korea would return to the six-party talks and seriously seek a negotiated solution to this problem. But it's far from clear that North Korea still maintains in any way whatsoever the goal of the six-party talks, and that is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It seems to have decided to base its security on keeping nuclear weapons rather than giving them up and gaining the benefits that that would bring. It has also said, at least for now, that the six-party talks are dead. It only wants to talk to the United States. So both China and the United States, along with others, will face two big issues. First of all, how to contain a North Korea that seems intent on keeping its nuclear weapons and has a reputation for reckless behavior. Second, this is not a particularly stable regime. Nobody knows what will happen there when Kim Jong-il passes from the scene. But one cannot rule out the possibility of some kind of collapse. And in that scenario, the United States has certain interests, China has certain interests. It's very important that we start a process of coordinating with each other to make sure that our respective interests are compatible and we act in ways that don't threaten the interests of the other. China's in a quandary here. It could bring down the regime if it wanted to because it provides key resources like petroleum. But it also is worried about its own domestic security. If it pushed too hard and the regime fell, then you would have probably refugees moving into northeast China and creating problems there. Second, China, since the UN Security Council resolution agreed to in June of 2009 after North Korea's nuclear test, has been quietly tightening its sanctions along with other countries. And that's to the good. Those who suggest that a little bit more pressure would help the United States fulfill its goals, I think ignore the real possibility that North Korea's made a decision that is incompatible with what both China and the United States want, which is denuclearization. In that case, increments of pressure are probably not going to change that. Only a change in North Korea's view of of how to preserve its security, or a collapse of the regime would change things. I don't think so. I think that we have actually gotten in trouble in the past where we have relied on one person to conduct what has now become a very complicated relationship. Instead, we should deal with China as we do with most important countries. Ensure that there is rich and effective interaction at the level of the two leaders. Ensure that there is good dialogue and communication between senior personnel of the two governments. And here the strategic and economic dialogue is a good device. We should rely on good old-fashioned diplomacy. We have a good foreign service. China has a good foreign service. Let's let them do their job. The place where there is a gap, I think, is in communication between the two militaries. If there's a danger in U.S.-China relations, it's in the security realm, but we don't talk to the People's Liberation Army as much as we should. That's not a fault on the U.S. side. It's a place where China has been more reluctant than we have, but perhaps that will change. It plays a huge role because it is now the leading emitter of greenhouse gases. Unless it and the United States make a credible commitment to reducing those and to mitigating their effect, there's no incentive for anybody else in the rest of the world to go along. So this is an area where a lot of countries will be watching what China does, along with watching what the United States does. Again, China's in a quandary here because it's still in the middle of its industrialization process. It is still seeking to be a prosperous country. There are a lot of poor people in China who still have yet to reap the benefits of economic growth. So many in China say, why should we make extraordinary sacrifices if the price is going to be poverty for our people? Taiwan is one of those issues where the United States and China could come into conflict despite the fact that they want a good relationship. And the dangers of that grew in the period from 1994 to 2008. China and Taiwan caught themselves in a spiral of mistrust, suspicion, and fear. Each took actions on the basis of its fears, which in turn provoked the other to feel more fearful and to take compensating actions. That situation, fortunately, changed in 2008 when there was a transfer of power to the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. The leader of that party believed that the best way to preserve China's security, freedom, and prosperity was not to provoke the mainland, but it was to reassure China that its intentions were benign. It wasn't interested in de jure independence. President Ma also sought to expand the areas of cooperation between the two sides and give more of a stake in a positive relationship. Fortunately, the Chinese leadership under Hu Jintao were ready for that kind of approach, and they have responded in kind. There are a number of ways that this process could stall, but for the foreseeable future, it seems that the two sides have found a way to reduce the tensions between them and to reduce the possibility of some kind of conflict through accident or miscalculation that could draw in the United States. Something very curious has happened since President Ma Ying-jeou took office. And that is that even though cross-strait relations have improved, even though he has tried at some political cost to reassure China about his good intentions, the military buildup that affects Taiwan has continued. China has not been willing to make an adjustment in its procurement to take account of positive changes on the political side. Frankly, nobody has an explanation for this. It could be simply that the PLA gets its hardware on a fairly rigid 5-year procurement cycle. And we happen to be in 2009 at the very end of that cycle. And so perhaps when they do the next procurement schedule, they will make that adjustment. The second reason, and it's the one we hear from Chinese military types, is that Beijing is far from confident that this positive trend is going to continue. They worry that pro-independence forces may come back to power, and in which case the deterrent that China has built up to forestall that objective needs to continue to grow. The irony of that is that if China continues to procure these systems and make Taiwan less secure, it may lead to the victory of these pro-independence forces, because they can say, as a result of President Ma's policies, we aren't more secure. We need a different approach. Finally, there's the possibility that civil-military relations are the explanation, and that China's civilian leadership cannot force the military to change procurement as a result of political changes. That China's military, to some extent, will decide what it needs to deter what it sees as the big threat.